let's now get into the historicity of all of this. So,
Okay.
just like a methodological question first. I know, so Josh Bowen has said that, what is it? If you find one archaeological find that fits with a part of the biblical narrative, that does not confirm the biblical narrative. And I was wondering if you could kind of explicate that position.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just as a little bit of a primer on this phenomenon, this thing that we call biblical archaeology. This is something that really developed towards the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. Archaeology as a discipline started to emerge and then started to develop as a increasingly as a more scientific field of study over the course of this time, and in no small part because of the Bible.
Mhm.
um Many of the earliest archaeological excavations were made by very devout men who were seeking to understand and to demonstrate the history behind the biblical texts. So, the first excavators at places like Jericho or AI um, were looking to find the evidence of the destruction of mentioned in the book of Joshua. Probably one of the most famous of all the so-called biblical archaeologists, William
Mm,
Foxwell Albright,
right.
who was active in the 1930s through the 1950s. When he started excavating at places like this, and then at Hatzor, and I think he also dug at at um at a rod. This is what he was doing. He was reading the text. He had the Bible in one hand and a spade in the other hand, and he was working to align these things to show that the archaeology matches the biblical story. So this is where it started. But archaeology over the course of probably the last 60, 70 years has changed quite dramatically as a result of what archaeologists have found and not found
Mm,
throughout Palestine and Israel. While some sites, such as Shiloh or most famously Hatzor, and I think it's important that we take some time to talk about Hatzor, so don't let me forget about that.
Hatzor. All
But
right.
sites like this, uh, look, they preserve some evidence from around the right time period, which shows that they potentially could align with what's described in the book of Joshua. The destruction of Hatzor is mentioned at the beginning of Joshua chapter 11. What Albright and then Yagel Yadin, famous Israeli statesman and archaeologist, when he dug at Hatzor, this is what they discovered: a city that was destroyed around the 12th century, sorry, around the 13th century, right around the time when um, scholars think, conservative scholars think that the Exodus and Conquest might have happened. And the other thing that they found was signs of defacing and defilement of cult objects. So idols were defaced, and cult places were defiled, which seems to align a fair bit with the I guess the Israelite theological ethos of Yahweh coming in and wiping out all the other gods. And then the city was burned in a very violent conflict. So on the surface of it, this looks good, right? This looks like it could align with what we're told in the book of Joshua. The problem, though, is that this doesn't work with every place.
Mm.
There are, there's dozens and dozens of cities and settlements mentioned in the southern and the northern campaigns in Joshua 10 and 11, which are said to have been conquered and destroyed. Now, some of this, what we have are a handful of these places, like Hatzor, which shows a destruction layer at about the same time period, and some features of that destruction which look like they could align with what happens in the book of Joshua. But then you have other sites, like at Ai, that I mentioned, where there's not even any occupation. The same holds for a place like Gibeon, which is actually described in Joshua 10 as like a large royal city. There's no occupation in the 13th century. And then you have a bunch of other sites, such as Debir or even Makeda, where, I mean, we don't even know exactly where many of these places are. And it's not for lack of trying, it's just for lack of being able to find anything. And I think it's worthwhile mentioning at this point, too. This is the same situation for those places that I mentioned from the book of Deuteronomy on the eastern side of the Jordan, in the Transjordan. So the cities, the two cities of the Amorites, which were said to have been destroyed by the Israelites. There is no evidence of any sort of occupation or fortification of any sites really on the Transjordan in the 13th century BCE. So this is when we talk about um, how to accurately provide a comprehensive, like, this is, in my opinion, providing a comprehensive archaeological assessment of the area in an effort to um uh this is what you have to do when attempting to discuss the historicity of the book of Joshua. And this is where it gets incredibly messy.
Mm.
Some of it works, but importantly, not everything does. And I mean, we'll get into talking about a variety of these issues at this point, I expect.
Yeah, because I there are times where I think for a lot of, like, fellow religious people, when we find like one find that confirms one thing in the Bible, we then say, oh, the whole Bible has been vindicated. It's like, wait, hold
Yes.
on, hold on, hold on. This individual part seems to have corroboration, but in our ordinary lives, if somebody gives us testimony and let's say one thing is true, we still want to know, what about the other parts, though,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think I can think of a couple of good examples here of what you're talking about is well, let's say back in the 1990s, I think it was the 1990s, maybe it was earlier, a very famous inscription was discovered at Tel Dan, written in Aramaic from the king
Mm,
of Aram Chadzael in the 9th century.
yeah.
And it makes mention there of the king of the house of David. And this is an extremely important discovery because it provides really our only third party epigraphic evidence for the existence of a figure, David. Of course, many conservative scholars latched onto this and said David was a real king who really ruled in Jerusalem, but then extrapolated from that to say we can now trust all the stories told about him in First and Second Samuel. But can we?
Mm,
I mean, all we have is an inscription which tells us that there was a dynastic succession in Jerusalem by the time of the 9th century. David lived at least 100 years earlier than this. But this particular inscription doesn't tell us anything else about this figure. And the same holds for the archaeological discoveries at the so-called City of David, which is on the south end of Jerusalem, in the area of the city that's called the Ophel. There have been monumental structures and signs of extensive urban occupation and fortification and expansion at the time of the 10th century. And a common interpretation of these discoveries is to say that this is evidence of the building activity of David and Solomon.
Mm.
Is it? What do we have here? We have evidence for occupation and fortification, and we have these stories about these figures who are set in the same time period. Maybe, but this is far from a settled matter, right? Like, this is where we have to look at the evidence from archaeology honestly and responsibly, but then, take great care in terms of how we're aligning these texts with what we read in the Bible.
Right.
And I'll say one more thing about this too. I read from this very ancient account of the Canaanite conquest from the Song of the Sea. In that text, it mentions specific groups of Canaanites, of people who occupied the land at the time of the conquest. Agony grips the residents of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom are horrified. The rulers of Moab, trembling, will seize them. Importantly, we don't know. We have no evidence for the existence of settlements for a couple of these groups in the land as early as the 13th century. There's no evidence of occupation, extensive occupation and fortification for the region of Edom as early as the 13th century. Not like what we would expect as it's described in the Bible. The same holds for Moab. Philistia, the Philistines, appear to be just kind of entering into and starting to control the region of the coastal plain, the southern coastal plain, in the 13th century. Now, what we do see in the archaeological record is that at some point around the 10th or the 9th century BCE, this sudden explosion and this emergence of a variety of these groups of people. This is where we see the beginnings of Moab. This is where we see the beginnings of Edom. This is where we see the beginnings of Israelite culture. Now, with that in view, from an historical perspective, does it make more sense that these places existed in the Bronze Age and are accurately described as having been routed and destroyed by Israelites in this ancient text, in an ancient text like the Song of the Sea? Or does it make more sense to think that this is actually describing something that occurred later in time, after the emergence of these small kingdoms together in this region from out of the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse, which happened, over the course of the 13th and the 12th centuries BCE? Does it make more sense to understand that these texts are describing that sort of geopolitical situation, especially considering that this is where all of our material culture comes from? Do you see what I'm getting at here?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Before we move on, though, did you want to talk about Hatzor again?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
This is a
Mm-hmm.
good point to talk about Hatzor as well. Thanks for reminding me. One of the other things we have to take into consideration here when speaking about the archaeology of the land and how it aligns with the conquest is to be clear about what we're talking about. What often happens is we look at what archaeologists have excavated and described as destruction layers, and we tend to imagine all of these things as part of some sort of conflict or conquest. Importantly, that's not so narrowly how archaeologists understand these things. Destruction layers are just that. They're evidence of various types of destruction that occur at particular places. Now, there's a recent article that was written by Igor Kramerman in 2017 where he summarizes destruction layers both by type and by period when they occurred. And he's discussed these in terms of 4 types. Type 1 is the complete burning of an entire city. So the whole city is just completely destroyed. That's a type 1 destruction. Type 2, there are signs of fire, but only in public buildings, like in the Acropolis, the palace, the temple, not in the larger residential areas of the city or the storage areas or I mean, I can't really call them industrial areas, but I think you know what I mean. Type 3, there's signs of fire, but only on the fortifications. So the walls of the city are burned themselves. And in type 4, there's no signs of fire, but other features of destruction like broken walls and buildings and those sorts of things. Now, really importantly here, when it comes to Hatzor, um, the city, as it's described in Joshua 10, is said to be completely destroyed. The city is entirely burned, and all of the residents of the city are killed. By the way, Hatzor in the 13th century was the largest city in Canaan, probably the most important city in Canaan at the time of the conquest, and it's described in Joshua 11 as well as a great city, as like the central royal city. So the situation that we have here, let me just see if I can pull up my notes here on this. So right, here we go. Okay. So um in Joshua 11:1, it says that when Yavin, the king of Hatzor, heard about the sweeping annihilation of the southern Canaanite cities, he assembled his own forces in a massive coalition with the kings from Madon, Shimron, Achshaph, and rulers in the hill country in the Arabah, south of Kinneret, that's the Sea of Galilee, and in the Shephelah. This is a lower sort of a lower fertile region in I guess kind of west of Jerusalem and Shechem there. So in the Shephelah, in the heights of Dor in the west, the Canaanites from the east and the west, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and Jebusites on the mountain, and the Hivites at the base of Hermon in the land of Mizpah. Mount Hermon is quite far north, located closer to Tyre or Sidon. So Joshua's army meets this coalition at the waters of Merom, and we don't know where this place is. The text tells us that Yahweh defeated them and chased them north to Sidon, west to Misphot Mayim, east to Mizpah. But this is geographically problematic since how does Joshua even mount? It says it's a surprise attack, but it says he marches all the way from Gilgal as far north as Kinneret to this place called Miram, which seems to be in this area. Are the northern kings just waiting for him to arrive there without noticing that he's coming? The text importantly says it's a surprise attack. And I'll say also, elements of the northern campaign reflect almost identically the way the Southern campaign is described. It's really formulaic, which also suggests that this is, much more a piece of literature than it is a piece of history. But many of these sites described as having been conquered were not even inhabited, as I mentioned, in the 13th century. We already talked about Gibeon and Makeda, but some of these places, Madon, Shimron, they're just unknown. The best evidence that scholars, apologists like to point to is what comes out of the city of Hatzor. Because as
Mhm.
I mentioned, it's a city that was burned. It was burned in the 13th century. There appears to have been a violent destruction there. Within the story of Joshua in Joshua 11, this seems to be how the text describes the destruction of this city. However, um, the we need to think through more carefully what archaeologists are talking about when they talk about the destruction of the city of Hatzor. So Hatzor 13 itself, which is the layer from the 13th century, suffered a violent destruction, but this wasn't a type 1 destruction. This was a type 2 destruction, meaning that it was the public buildings, so like the temple, the Acropolis, that were destroyed and burned. Now, the other really interesting thing about Hatzor is that, according to Igor Kramerman, it contains a lot of evidence of what's called crisis architecture in the decades leading up to the destruction of Hatzor in the 13th century. So, what crisis architecture is, this is kind of an interesting feature of modern archaeology that's developed over the last couple of decades. Crisis architecture is such that indicates a repurposing of buildings uh, that appear to be the result of some sort of internal crisis within the city. So it's indicative of a um, social conditions and economic conditions that have started to break down. So some of these larger, more elaborate structures fall into more disrepair, lack of use. Poorer materials are used for repairs. Um, Buildings within the city start to be cannibalized in order to serve for other more utilitarian structures. So, on the whole, crisis architecture is a way of describing changes that occur within the construction and the architecture of a city, which seem to indicate that there's a social, economic, political crisis that's taking place. And this is what we find in Hatzor in the decades leading up to this final destruction, which I think is kind of interesting.
Mm.
So, according to Kremerman, he says this response this is a response to situations of social crisis. So remember, I noted that all the public buildings in the city were burned, monuments were defaced and destroyed, and people will like to look at that and point to that as evidence of the Israelites coming in and destroying all the foreign gods, right? And yet the domestic buildings within this city remained intact. And here's what Kremerman says. Although some of them contained complete pottery vessels and other objects, some other buildings were evidently abandoned in an organized manner. This suggests a rather different end than what is described in the book of Joshua. So what I'm getting at here is that while there is some evidence in the city of Hatzor which suggests, this violent destruction, why? Who is it that actually destroyed this city? Was this the result of invaders coming in and fighting, starting a war? with the city of Hatzor as described in the book of Joshua? Or could this have been the result of an internal conflict? Could it have been the result of a social upheaval that took place within the city that we see some evidence for in this crisis architecture leading up to this final destruction? This would also help to explain why so many of the domestic buildings themselves were left untouched. This would also help to explain why the destruction was limited to the public spaces, those controlled by the city rulers and the administration at the time of this destruction. This would also explain why a number of the monuments were themselves defaced. See, the problem I'm getting at here is that very often, while archaeologists are able to detect destruction, it becomes a much more difficult matter understanding how some of these destructions occur.
Mm.
Cities burn. Cities burn because of accidents. And we see some of this within Canaan as well. One of the cities that's mentioned in the book of Joshua as having been destroyed is Lachish. Well, we have a destruction layer at Lachish that dates to the 13th century, but this too is just restricted to a large temple inside the city. It's the only thing that burned. We don't know why. But then after the burning of this temple, what we see on the heels of that right away is a reconstruction of a new structure and an actual expansion of the city without any change in the material culture. So what that means is that up to the 13th century, Lachish was a Canaanite city. This temple in the city was burned down for some reason, not necessarily because of some sort of invasion. In fact, seems probably not, because following on that, there's no change in terms of the occupation of the city. It's still a Canaanite city, and they rebuild it.
Mm.
So, like, these are the sorts of problems that we encounter when we're talking about what happens in the archaeological record and trying to align that with the destruction of Canaan. So I think Hatzor is really important because it's one of these sites that apologists and many conservative scholars like to latch onto and say this is evidence of the Israelites coming in and destroying the city. Maybe, but it's not nearly so clear. In fact, I think an alternative hypothesis, an alternative idea to this could be that the residents of Hatzor destroyed their own city. And maybe the Israelites, in part, are the result of that. The people who came out of that moved into the highlands, the Judean highlands, the whole country, established these smaller tribal settlements away from these large Canaanite cities.
I really appreciate that very thorough explanation of just all the evidence and how you could possibly interpret it. And I also like how, you didn't try to say, oh, I definitely know what happened here. You said sometimes we don't know. Sometimes the evidence can be interpreted in various ways. And for, let's say, that apologist who is insisting this is how it happened, they have to bear that burden of proof. And because you're making a more modest claim, you don't have to go that far.
No, yes.
Mhm.
Exactly. And that's why, I mean, I'm a fan of modest claims. They're
Yep.
always so. Something else that I forgot to mention with regards to Hatzor that just came to mind now, especially in terms of how to interpret our evidence with regards to some of these sites. Importantly, um, one of the things missing from this destruction layer at Hatzor was evidence of arrowheads or sling stones. According to an archaeologist by the name of Zuckerman, arrowheads and sling stones were not found in large numbers anywhere across this site. And what this suggests is that, like, this is one of the ways in which archaeologists can hypothesize an invasion, right? if you've got lots of arrowheads, that suggests that people are shooting arrows at each other. If you got lots of slings running around, that suggests that they're using them to sling things inside and outside of the city. And this is the kind of stuff that's missing at Hatzor too. So this isn't, by no stretch of the imagination is any of this stuff what I would call a smoking gun, right? I
Mm-hmm.
don't really believe in smoking guns when it comes to archaeology or history. Uh, but I would say that this is evidence which seems to indicate that Hatzor was destroyed for some other reason than that it was invaded
Mm.
by hordes of Israelites.
On this historicity section, let me just ask two more questions and then we'll get into
Yeah, for sure.
ethics. So,
Okay.
a lot of the statements that you've made are contrary to, let's say, the conservative dating of the Exodus and the Conquest, because the two kind of depend on each other. And
Mhm.
if somebody, let's say, takes the late view of the Exodus, like Michael and some others, how
Yes.
would that shape the evidence? Could they? I mean, you said that in some instances it would make the evidence less problematic, but does it get them to the
Mhm.
home stretch or not really?
I really don't think it does because of the nuances within uh the types of destruction that we're seeing at the sites that we can point to and say, yeah, this is something that works with the time period, with the 13th century. Um because of just the totality of the data, right? You
Mm,
don't have Moabites and Edomites living in the area at the time, in the 13th century BCE, which are an important component of the conquest story. Several of these sites, such as Gibeon or Ai or Heshbon on the other side of the Jordan, are just not occupied in the 13th century, and not even until much later in the 10th, 9th centuries BCE. This is a problem for setting the conquest in the 13th century BCE. Um, and then I didn't even get around to talking about the whole problem of what's happening in Egypt in and around this time, right?
mm,
One of the things that's happening in the 13th century, if you're going to date the conquest to this period, is that Egypt still controls the region. Now, I
mm,
know some people are going to quibble about what exactly that looked like. Uh, it's not like, and I would agree, it's not like the Egyptian army just had the entire area completely occupied and secured. Um, but we do know that there were actual Egyptian garrisons throughout the region. We also know that the rulers of a whole bunch of these cities, such as Lachish, Jerusalem, Shechem, Hatzor, these were all, at a minimum, still paying taxes and tariffs to the Egyptians. There is piles of evidence of Egyptian cultural influence on these cities. We have correspondences between the rulers in Canaan and the rulers in Egypt, which shows that they were in a vassalage arrangement with the Egyptian pharaohs. Um, Egyptologists and archaeologists will tell us that the situation in Canaan in the 13th century is one of Egyptian control. And this is a situation that doesn't end until after the reign of Ramses III at the end of the 13th century and going into the 12th century. In fact, it's for this reason, Suan, that uh, one scholar by the name of Gary Rensburg has
mm.
actually changed his opinion on this and advocates for a 12th century Exodus and Conquest because of the Egyptian quest. I'll just read something here from him. Historical documentation clearly reveals an ongoing Egyptian presence in the land of Canaan during the reign of Ramesses III. Egyptian officials were stationed at Gaza and Deir el-Balach in the southern coastal plain, at Lachish, Tel Serah, which is perhaps Ziklag, Tel El Farah, which is in the south, and perhaps Beth Shemesh in the southern in the southern inland area. In addition to centers near the coast, such as Gaza and Deir al-Balach, and at Megiddo, and most prominently Beit Shean in the north. In addition, Egyptian mining in the Timna Valley continued throughout the 19th dynasty and into the reign of Ramesses III during the 20th dynasty, though perhaps with a brief interruption during the transition between the two dynasties. Amahai Mazar has characterized the Egyptian presence in Canaan as domination during the 19th and 20th dynasties, albeit considerably weakened during the reign of Merneptah, who reigned after 1200, and he characterizes the situation as being this way all the way up to about 850 BCE, which is really when we start to see the emergence of these independent kingdoms: Israel, Moab, Edom. They're probably there before, but this is where they start to really take control of the area. So this marks the end. Mazar marks the end of the 20th dynasty after Ramses III as the end of Egyptian presence in Canaan. So importantly, I think this is a problem. If there's an exodus and a conquest of Israelites coming out of Egypt and into the land of Canaan, as Josh Bowen has often said, they're basically leaving Egypt and entering into territory that's controlled by Egypt. I mean, how effective is that, and what is the result of that? I think it's an issue. I know that there are apologists who have tried to downplay what Egyptian domination or Egyptian occupation and control in the area means at this time, but it doesn't seem to fit with the biblical story, which is a story of escape out of Egypt and the elimination of any sort of Egyptian control. It seems pretty far-fetched to think that even if this happened, even if the Egyptians were not in a position to stop an invading horde of Israelites from conquering and taking control of these cities, it does seem, based on the evidence that we have at our disposal, like a stretch to suggest that the Israelites weren't, at a minimum, just walking into a situation where they were paying taxes and tariffs to the Egyptians, right? So, and it very interestingly, I'll just say one more thing about this. There's some elements of the Exodus story in particular which seem to fit with the reign of Merneptah much later in the 12th century, which again, there are problems in terms of how you're dating destruction layers in the Conquest on the basis of this. But I think what we can say is that perhaps a pharaoh like Merneptah, who reigned at the end of the 12th century, may have provided there may be memories or echoes of some conflict between him and the residents of Canaan, at the end of the 12th, beginning of the 11th century, which greatly contributed to this story of Exodus and Conquest.